Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here amongst so many colleagues and friends. As you know, I'm going to talk about empowerment of national parks. And to do that, I think it's helpful to look at the context, to try and understand better where we are. As some of you will know, I've had plenty of time to be around and enjoy this and other national parks over the last year. And so these are my reflections on where we are in the broader political context. This may all be obvious to you, I don't know, but nevertheless I'm going to do it and then move on to talk about what specifically I think we can do and what needs to happen. So the context, I think, is that, broadly speaking, if you look back at the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, across that broad spread of time, you look across a period when, in general, despite advances and then declines and problems and new ministers and bad ministers and good ministers, overall there was a long-term trend towards an increase in environmental protection. And with that increase in protection, there was an increase in resources, there was an increase in monitoring, and there was an improvement in expertise. So it was an upward trend across a whole range of environmental protections. And I think that we probably tend to underestimate the extent to which all those different measures in terms of water and air and city pollution and so on were actually successful. So things aren't nearly as good as they should be, but they were getting an awful lot worse, and an awful lot of time and money was spent putting them better. So there was an awful lot of a success story there. But there comes a point, and I think it was just after the financial crash, so around about 2009, when that overall shift to the better faltered, and then it began to get worse. And I think that's where we are. It's gone into reverse. And I think that means a lot of the assumptions we've made about how and where we're successful in improving things need to change. Now that reversal takes many forms. I think oddly, an outright destruction of a regulation or reversal of the law has been relatively rare. I can think of the planning system as an exception. There's been clear changes and removal of powers across the country and in national parks where the planning controls, the environmental protection is less strong than it was. Now, that's been an outright reversal. And of course we're on the cusp of potentially some very big and damaging reversals of environmental protection through the UK's replacement for EU law. And we've already seen that the true independence of the European Commission and European institutions and its replacement in this country has not gone to a body like the National Audit Office reporting to Parliament, but has gone to a body appointed by government. So I'll come back to this, but no, I'll come back to that later. But those losses, as I say, I don't think that the outright changes are the biggest factors which have been involved. I think that a bigger factor has been the loss of resources to the environmental regulators across the spectrum. There's one or two exceptions. I think the Nuclear Waste Inspectorate has got considerably more money, but if you think of the Environment Agency, if you think of the Forestry Commission, if you think of Natural England, if you think of all the local authorities, if you think of the National Park authorities, they've seen really substantial reductions in the resources they've got to spend. And that has made a real difference to their ability to carry out the environmental regulation which protects public good, which protects the public interest. Now that's, I think, a really important factor, but there's another factor which I think has also been really damaging and has helped with this decline in environmental protection, and that's words. words, they do make a difference. And when politicians say that they want to roll out the red carpet for developers, and that regulation is simply an inhibition on business, and we're going to be developer friendly, and we're going to unravel the tangled complexity of bewildering regulation, all those things matter. And they have their impact on the regulators, and they have their impact on the people who are regulated. And so I think that these two factors of the rhetoric of what politicians say, both in public but also in private to the regulatory agencies, has a real effect on what's happening and what happens in the countryside. And I think this has led and is leading to more loss of public value that you can see around you in the countryside. Indeed, I think you can see something which, when I started campaigning in the 80s, really, there was widespread loss, acute loss of habitat. Hedges were being ripped out, marshes were being drained, and I think that actual environmental destruction is coming back. I mean, there's been a lot of publicity recently about water pollution around the coasts. I think you can see more water pollution in rivers. And of course, a thing which has gone unremarked is the loss of land that has been in agri-environment schemes for decades. In the farm scheme here for 25 years, and then in agri-environment schemes being ploughed out. It's not been widely reported in the national media, as far as I can see. So I think that there has been this real change in this watershed. But there's an oddity here, because while there's been this rise in public protection, as I say, right from the 50s through to the noughties, alongside public opinion, the decline hasn't been matched by a decline in public interest in the environment. On the contrary, that's as high as it's ever been. There's huge public support. So how is it that this decline has been allowed to happen without a huge level of public protest? And sort of, why does the government get away with it? Well, the government is superb at some things. You might expect this mismatch, but in fact the government is supremely good at getting people to focus on the small things and the short-term things. Remember plastic straws? Remember plastic straws? The calamity, the national disgrace of plastic straws. We must act on plastic straws, stop plastic straws. Yes, the minister may intervene. Yes, the minister's going to do something about plastic straws. What are they? 1/1000th of the problem? You know, it's sort of so clever and so good. Beavers. Beavers is another one. I mean, beavers are practically gone wild anyway. I mean, you know, they're there, aren't they? But beavers will solve the problem. So let's give it up for beavers, everyone. You know, beavers is the future. We're great on the environment. We're doing beavers, everyone. And you know, I have to say, I looked at the government's interim response on Glover in preparation for this, and I was lost for words. But then I found two words, monumentally pathetic, I thought. Because what is it doing? It's considering new AONBs. When I was on the NE board, I remember the day that we had a list of, I think, about 40 proposed candidates for new national parks and AONBs. So we were considering them, that was about 10 years ago. So now the dynamic new thrust for the future is we're going to consider just 3. Well, I mean, I gather there's actually a time scale now, and it would be a good thing if they happened, I believe. But really, we've again been asked to focus on something very small and you know, I won't say unimportant, but short term. The thing above all which struck me about this was with the 25-year plan, because I'd been sitting there thinking, right, well, really, the governments are going to be held to account because we've had a biodiversity 2020 strategy and we're not meeting it. But then along came the 25-year plan, and suddenly, well, we weren't thinking about the 2020 strategy, we were thinking about the next strategy 25 years away. So it's going to take us a generation to work out what we have to do to stop the environment being as good as the generation it was, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's just, you know, it's talk so far. So that's the context in which I think we have to think about Glover. And I wonder whether to say anything about Glover because, well, for lots of reasons. Partly, you know, I've known a couple of members of the panel for a long time, and I have great respect for them, and honestly great respect for them, and indeed affection for them. But I think I do need to say that I think that Glover was really very unfortunate in several ways, and sold us short. One of the first things I noticed when I read it was how it asked for more of so many things. More of this, more of that, more wildlife, more visitors, a greater diversity in the visitors. And I was thinking, but yes, well, I agree with all that. I thought everyone did. Well, why would I want to come and work for a national park? Because I believe in all these things. You know, I was one of those kids that had frogs in the bath and caterpillars in the bedroom. You know, I wanted to do more for wildlife. That's why I was there. And, you know, I have to confess, yeah, you know, I'll admit it, and maybe this colours my thinking about it, and it shouldn't. But yes, it was a bit galling for it to be implied that, you know, some of us who have the honour to be in charge of bits of the park weren't actually passionate about this. So I thought, well, that surely I thought I was. So. But I think their analysis of why more wasn't happening was just wrong. Because my experience of working with DEFRA and Whitehall, and there are some excellent people there doing good things, and I bear them no ill will or anything, but my general experience of the level of commitment and passion for the things that Glover's wants was almost always, very often, normally, in the national park authorities, and yes, with the members, as well as with the officers. And I'm not convinced that centralising everything, where the people are presumably going to be appointed by all those great ministers, who haven't been great friends to national parks often, who quite often been climate sceptics. So the national parks are supposed to lead on this stuff? Well, we were leading. Back in the noughties, one of the national parks, well, the North York Moor was okay, won the national award for work on climate change. And then there was Owen Patterson. Bless him. You know, one of the pleasant, and I mean that, one of the pleasantest people who's ever visited us. Enormously courteous and pleasant and interested. But did you flaunt our work on climate change? You keep it under the radar. And then you get a 40% cut. I mean, I'm sorry, it's not the national park authorities who didn't want to do these things. It's been a lack of DEFRA as a weak department being able to support environmental things, and ministers who have too often, haven't been keen on our work. So I think the problem with that is that therefore Glover doesn't tell us how we're going to do more. And that's what we need to know. And I think that the net effect of Glover has so far been to weaken NPAs without strengthening the national parks. So, well, what do we do? How do we mobilise opinion and support for a really strong agenda, a really strong set of empowerments that will let national parks deliver everything they want to, everything that you all want to? I don't think there's an awful lot of argument about that, about what needs to be done. But how we mobilise and how we galvanise that support and persuade governments, I think that is a really difficult issue, because I think this position we're in is different. It's more akin to, it used to be when I started campaigning, when government said brazenly, it is illegal to spend any public money from the agriculture budget on the environment. Seriously, the first thing we were doing was getting a legal opinion to say that's not right. And then they said, well, it may be legal, but it's wrong. It's not desirable. And so there were some very fundamental things that needed to be done. And when you met a minister, you didn't expect to get along for the minister to say yes. Over the last 30, 40 years, that's changed quite a lot, and we sort of expected to get a yes and expected things to happen. And often it has done, under all sorts of different governments. But now we're in a different position, I think. And so the question is, what do we do? And I think, but look, you may just all know better. I don't know, but this is my hazard at a guess as to how we might approach this. I think we have to think really long term. I think probably, let's say we thought, what do we want to have achieved in 10 years' time? And have some sort of a plan about, well, how you galvanise public support to create the pressure so that you can strengthen national parks to do what the public needs over some time. I think for the first 3 years, the issue is about galvanising opinion rather than meeting ministers. And I keep talking about public opinion because I think that is our one really great and unusual asset, the huge level of public support for national parks. And I think we've got to, and again, I'm not sure if I'm right on this, but I think it's about refinding ways to use that. Part of what's needed is setting out a really bold stall and not being timid about measures that are needed to deal with the scale of the climate catastrophe, or I forget, yeah, you know what I mean, and the need for much more nature. So we need to be bold, and I'll have some suggestions in a few minutes about what sort of things we should ask for. There was an argument we used to have regularly when the chief executives and the chairs met. And it was about when there was a proposal to cut national park grants, and we got quite used to that, would we use the bleeding stumps argument? And I was generally on the losing side of an argument which said, no, that would really piss off the government. No, we shouldn't talk about bleeding stumps. We've got to be positive and say we can raise money in lots of other ways and be really constructive and all the rest of it. And we were. But the fact is there are bleeding stumps. And there were a lot of redundancies, painful in themselves. But there's also been real impacts on the National Park Authority's ability to deliver all those things that Glover wants. And I think we have to say so and be able to use those facts and examples. I think we need to go back to the point I made about actual damage happening in parks. I think we need to be ready to use those examples with the public to say, well, actually, this isn't just the authorities, but there's actually change happening out in the countryside, which is bad. And there was a point that someone made at the back, someone asked the question, what would national parks look like, I think? And I think that's a really good question, because I think part of this is being visionary and being pictorial. What's the word? Having pictures to show what it would be like. And so I've been thinking about this. So I was thinking, well, what would be in that park? What is going to be in this great picture of how we want to be? This is what it is now, and it's getting worse, but this is what it should be to deal with emergencies. And what would there be? Well, just some random things. Some of the really big eyesores in national parks would be removed. We've got rid of a lot, quite a few, but there's plenty of eyesores, big eyesores, major developments in parks, which could go. We would have more trees, the right sort of trees, a lot more trees in the right place. We would have a lot more wetter areas. I mean, these are things I think which are pretty much known. We would have a properly integrated transport system. We would have more of the heritage accessible, huge tunnels unopened in not far from here. And we would have some large wild herbivores. I say herbivores because people talk on about carnivores. With the things, some of the things that used to graze the national park before humans eliminated them. Some of which are modern day domesticated stock, but we would have big herbivores grazing wild. And I think that creates some really attractive pictures to go with. Yes, but look, there's a problem. I'm Colin, how long?
About 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes, okay. So I hope that's given, just the beginnings of some thoughts about, okay, how do you mobilise? What does this mean? What do you do? But something tells me, but I may just have got this wrong and not be in touch, but sort of we need a reset of how we do the campaigning because we're in a different place. And it is going to be very difficult because of the pressures on public budgets. Although I sort of smile in a terrible way about that, because I remember in austerity we were told that we couldn't have any money because of the size of the deficit. But look at the deficit we've got now. I mean, obviously you could actually forgive me. Anyhow, so what things should you ask for? Well, I've come up with a list of 14 empowerments. Come up with some of these are old hat, and some of these might be the earliest memory that anyone has of a national park, actually, the debate on some of these have been going on so long. But some of them I think are relatively new. The first thing I've got down is about making national park management plans enforceable. That isn't entirely new, but I've got a couple of examples of how I think you might do that. The first one is this. This is the example. In a national park, you're the planning authority. If there's a listed building that's falling down, you can write to the owner and say, "Dear owner, you must repair that building. And if you don't, we'll do something about it." And if the owner doesn't repair it, the planning authority, the national park, has got a right of entry to the building and can call in contractors to specify what work needs to be done and can come up with a programme of work and cost it and can get contractors in to do the work and then charge the owner for doing the work, and ultimately if the owner wouldn't pay they'll go to prison. And national park authorities do that, and local planning authorities do that, and owners often don't like it, but I mean that's fine. If you're the owner of a listed building, you know what you've got. Now my question is this: we can do that for our most precious bits of the built heritage. Why does a national park authority not have the power to do the same for the most precious bits of the natural heritage? I don't think there's a good answer as to why not. So there will be my first example of something you could do on a pretty site-specific basis. Then let's look on a slightly broader canvas. Can you remember seeing a big road or highway in a national park? Yes. Chances are that wasn't owned by the Highways Authority. Most roads aren't owned by highways authorities. But at some point, I imagine in the 19th or 20th century, Parliament decided that the nation needed, it was in the public interest, that we had a proper transport system that allowed our economy to function so that people could get from A to B. So they gave the Highways Authority huge and draconian powers over the highway, although the Highway Authority didn't own it, so that they could put down concrete and metal and put up signs and all those things on the highway. Now those things are regulated, obviously, to some extent at a national level, but the Highways Authority, as you may well have discovered, have got huge powers over things which meet the public good in national parks. So my question to you is, why hasn't a national park got any power to take charge of an area and do what's in the public interest on it, given that the critical things today are not more transport, but are climate change and more nature? That's what today's public interest is. All I'm saying is that we do what politicians did back in the 19th century, but apply it to the environment. So that would be, you might base it on Section 3 maps or whatever. And so that would be another suggestion for, within parts of the park, how you might go about making park management plans enforceable. I think in practice that if you had those powers, an awful lot would be done by incentive. The problem at the moment is that if you try and do things just by incentive, all the most awkward people simply don't do it, and you have to pay a lot of money. It would be more cost effective if you had regulatory powers because it would make the incentive cheaper. And some people would lose, some private landowners probably wouldn't like it and they wouldn't get as much money. But where is the public interest in this? The fact is that we work with the best landowners, and there are a lot, and I have nothing against landowners. In fact, I know lots of them, and as I said about Harold, and the people here, and they're lovely people to work with, and they're lovely guys, and often they do a lot of good that we don't know about. I believe that. But there is a matter of public interest here relevant to this day and age. Right, so the others are a lot quicker.
About 5 minutes, Andy.
Okay. 2. I would put a duty to further or some other similar word on all public bodies. I would ensure that there were good and high standards of regulation of private bodies in national parks. Very important now, so many of those are privatised. And indeed, in many instances, I would insist on specific higher bits of regulation, for instance, on new undergrounding in national parks. I would create 3 new statutory positions for national park authorities. Local authorities have these monitoring officers, finance officers. In national parks, I would have a statutory ecologist, a statutory archaeologist, and a statutory access officer. And I'll give them the power to call in decisions which are obviously contrary to national park purposes. Number 5, I would reinstate the planning powers lost over the last 10 years and strengthen controls over private tracks. Number 6, I will give national park authorities the power to stop tourism developments which have an unsustainable wider transport impact. And I don't mean some woolly words in a transport circular, I mean something more like building regs which allow you to actually stop it and not be overturned by an inspector. 7, I would give NPAs the ability to veto forest design plans on the grounds of conservation or access and give them proper length statutory consultee rights on felling applications. Unfortunately, forest design plans are going backwards nowadays, and we're beginning to see an increase in coniferisation again. 8, I would give NPAs the ability to ban second homes in some areas and bring in wider financial penalties on these. I mean, these are things we know, don't we? 9, I would introduce a levy on water companies to pay for environmental work in national parks at a level determined by the public. This is what's done with the national grid for infrastructure. That raises 400 million for undergrounding. So I'm talking about a potential sort of realistic funding for national parks from big companies that are making big profits, approved by the public. Number 10, I would transfer all publicly owned car parks in national parks to the National Park Authority. That would put them in a much stronger position to organise transport rationally and would give them income. 11, I will say almost nothing about governance, because I think it's often a red herring. Where a principal authority has got several members on an authority, I would reduce that to 1, and I would add local regional interest groups instead of those members. I think that would increase the diversity of authorities in several different ways. 12, I would set up a central, cross-government central unit, civil servants getting together, make them do an annual report. That's how you could do, if that was working properly, you could do transport signing off the main trunk roads to all national parks in a couple of years. And you could get a night under the stars in every national park in a couple of years. You don't need legislation. You need a bit of money and the civil servants to agree. I mean, it's 13, and in a way this should come first. I would set up a study group to look at international best practice. I mean, Glover virtually said nothing about any international comparisons. We've got a lot to learn from abroad. Let's have a quick look at that before we proceed to implement the other 13. And finally, my number 14, what is it? It's back to words. Echoes something that Kate said. It's the words we need from ministers. Ministers who will tell you that they love national parks, they appreciate the huge range of values that they bring to society. A minister who will say, you need to do tough stuff for us. We need you to help tackle the climate emergency, the nature crisis. We need you to do and deliver on behalf of the nation these things which are in the wider interest. And I will back you up, national park authorities, when you find people who object. I want you to do this work for the government, for the nation, for the public. And if we had that, that would make a huge difference. Thank you, my 14 points.